Hi, I'm William Spaniel. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Rochester, and this is a video version of the presentation I will be giving at the 2013 Peace Science Society meeting. The title is War Exhaustion and the Stability of Arms Treaties. Why did the Soviet Union proliferate in 1949? This is actually a chapter out of my dissertation, and if you look at the video link, or look at the video description, you will find a link to that paper that you can download and read for yourself. So I want to begin with a very simple observation, which is that nuclear weapons are bad. They explode, they kill people, they poison the environment. And if those three things weren't bad enough, they're also extremely costly to build, they're costly to maintain, and building the necessary delivery mechanisms for them is also obscenely expensive. So given that these things are very bad and very costly, why on earth do states develop them? Well, we have some explanations, and in fact, the current literature gives three necessary conditions for proliferation. First, we need to have bargaining be zero-sum. We need to have some sort of coercive bargaining relationship with a rival. In other words, if you're at peace with everyone, it doesn't make sense for you to develop nuclear weapons. Second, we need weapons to be worth the cost. If, in the extreme, going and building a nuclear weapon would drive you to bankruptcy, then it doesn't make sense for you to develop a nuclear weapon at that point. And the third condition is that preventative war needs to not be credible for any of your rivals. So if one of your rivals would interfere and, say, launch a preventative war and destroy your nuclear power plant or whatever, then at that point it makes sense for you to not proliferate because you can save on the wasted investment cost in constructing that nuclear power plant or whatever that nuclear program was, and you also save yourself from the expense of a preventative war being thrown against you. So if we take those current the current conventional wisdom on the subject and apply it to the Soviet Union, then the Soviet Union's proliferation in 1949 was rational because of the competition with the United States gave the Soviet Union a zero-sum bargaining environment. The expense was worthwhile because while the weapons were expensive, they assured the Soviet Union would maintain a superpower status throughout the Cold War. And finally, as a sort of revealed preference, the United States did not intervene when the Soviet Union built the nuclear weapon in 1949 and tested the weapon in 1949, and so preventative war was not credible for the United States. So this rationalizes the Soviet decision to proliferate according to the literature as it stands today. But I want to argue that these are not sufficient conditions to understand proliferation. These are necessary conditions to understand proliferation. And the reason is because you can bargain, right? So building these nuclear weapons are very expensive. So why can't we sit down at a bargaining table and reach an agreement where I perhaps offer you some sort of concessions, and in response to those concessions, you say, thank you, I'm not going to develop the nuclear weapons now. I'm not going to waste the costs on developing a bomb at that point. Now, obviously, these sorts of agreements would be Pareto improving. These would be mutually preferable to a situation where one state would develop a nuclear weapon. However, there's questions of credibility. Why wouldn't the declining state, or rather, why wouldn't the rising state take some sort of concession up front and then go ahead and develop a nuclear bomb later on? And what I'm going to be showing you in the first half of this presentation is that actually bargaining usually does work. Declining states give immediate concessions to the rising state to match the rising state's potential power, and the rising state does not build in response to this. And the reason it's not going to build is because the declining state is going to be giving essentially everything that the rising state would receive if it were to build a nuclear weapon. So at that point, building is no longer necessary because the rising state's already getting what it wants. And of course, this result is efficient because we're not having wasted costs of nuclear development or wasted costs of war. So that's the first half of the presentation. The second half of the presentation deals with this underlying question of why then did the Soviet Union proliferate? And what I'm going to show in that second half of the presentation is that a commitment problem can occur and bargaining can fail if a declining state's desire to fight a preventative war changes over time. So in summary, the United States would have been happy to buy off the Soviet Union at the beginning of the Cold War, but the concessions that the United States would have to give to the Soviet Union to buy off the Soviet Union would have disappeared once the United States war exhaustion following World War II had ended. And so the Soviet Union proliferated to guarantee its position in the world and guarantee the concessions that the United States had to give it to appease the Soviet Union. Okay, so that wraps up the introduction to this, let's get into the model. So I'm going to begin by giving a basic bargaining model of nuclear weapons development. And I want to focus on intuition here rather than propositions and a lot of heavy, thick game theoretical logic. So I'm going to start off by giving you the key features of the model. I'm going to show you the game tree, and I'm going to show you the outcomes that result in this model. So the key feature of this model, first, we are going to be adapting a bargaining model of war framework here. So we're going to take the standard Furon 1995 framework and tweak it to deal with a situation where a rising state might be building a nuclear weapon. This is really useful because it allows us to easily compare the results that we're going to be getting here to existing results that use the same bargaining model of war framework. Second, I'm going to twist that bargaining model of war and allow for endogenous costly development of nuclear weapons. These should be relatively straightforward assumptions. It's trivially true that a rising state to build a nuclear weapon has to endogenously and actively choose to build a nuclear weapon, right? Nuclear weapons don't grow on trees. You have to actually develop a nuclear weapon on your own. And it's also very costly for you to do that. So these are intuitive assumptions, and they're going to be built into the model. Third, I'm going to have the interaction continue through time. This is going to allow us to properly investigate whether commitment problems exist or not. And fourth, I'm going to make the declining state strategically vulnerable insofar as the declining state has to make offers to the rising state and make bribes or offer bribes to the rising state, which the rising state could conceivably say, thank you, I'm going to take that, and I'm going to go ahead and build a nuclear weapon anyway. The reason I'm doing this is because this is a big concern if you read the policy literature on the United States negotiating with Iran right now. These policy folk are really interested and really concerned in the United States offering concessions to Iran and Iran taking those concessions and developing a nuclear weapon anyway. So I want to build that problem into the model and actually show that you can get bargain resolutions, you can get agreements to occur even when the declining state is vulnerable in that manner. So the game tree looks like this. We have a declining state making a division of the good or offering a division of the good between 0 and 1, essentially a proportional split of the good to the rising state. And the rising state will see that offer that's being made and choose whether to accept, reject, or build in response. If the rising state accepts, that locks in the payoffs for the period, and we repeat this bargaining process and this bargaining stage in the next period. If the rising state rejects, then we have a war, which concludes with payoffs similar or actually identical to what you'd expect from the bargaining model of war payoffs. So the rising state receives PR, portion of the good, in expectation if it were to fight a war, and it pays a cost CR. And of course, the declining state receives the remainder of the good, 1 minus PR, but pays a cost CD to fight. The last option for the rising state is to build a weapon. Now, if the rising state tries building a weapon, it's going to take whatever offer the declining state made to it to begin with, and it's going to be able to keep that, and it's going to pay a cost K to develop a weapon. So this positive cost K reflects how costly it is for the rising state to build a nuclear bomb. But if the rising state builds, the declining state will see that and have the opportunity to launch preventative war. If the declining state does that, then we have the same war payoffs as before. Notice these things are identical here, between here and here. If the declining state chooses not to launch preventative war, we advance into a post-shift bargaining stage where the declining state offers some amount between 0 and 1, and the rising state chooses to accept or reject. It can't build any more because it already has the nuclear weapons at this point. So if the rising state accepts, then that locks in the division for that period, and we repeat this bargaining process in the next period. And if the rising state rejects, we have war payoffs just like before, with one exception. The rising state is now receiving P prime R, and this P prime R is going to be greater than this PR over here. The idea is that in war, the rising state will receive more in expectation by having nuclear weapons than if it doesn't have nuclear weapons. So essentially, nuclear weapons improve the bargaining position and improve the outside options for the rising state and make the outside option worse for the declining state. So that's the game tree. I now want to show you the equilibrium outcomes as a function of the cost to build and the extent of the power shift. So if you give me a cost to build and an extent of a power shift, I will take those two pieces of information and I will plot it out on this graph right here, and I will show you what equilibrium result occurs with that cost to build and that power shift. So starting off with extreme power shifts. When the extent of the power shift is great, this is where the declining state would prefer launching a preventative war to allowing a power shift to transpire. And so as a result, the declining state can deter the rising state from proliferating out of the stick of preventative war. It can use that threat to fight a preventative war to convince the rising state not to build a nuclear weapon. The declining state ends up really well off here because it gets to not offer any concessions and then still induce the rising state's compliance because it is not having to offer, or because the rising state would have a preventive war thrown against it if it were to try to build. So this works when the extent of the power shift is great relative to the declining state's cost to launch a preventative war. That cost to launch a preventative war is going to come back to us in the second half of the presentation. All right, so what happens on the other end of the spectrum when the extent of the power shift is small relative to the cost of building? Well, in this case, the concessions are not worth the cost, right? This is where it's just too costly for me to develop a weapon, and whatever sort of benefit I'm going to get out of the weapon is going to be small because the extent of the power shift is relatively small compared to the cost to build. And so as a result, it's simply not worth the investment for me to build a nuclear weapon. Here, the declining state knows that the rising state does not have a credible threat to develop the weapon, and therefore doesn't offer any concessions to the rising state, and we still don't have any proliferation occurring because it's just so costly to build that nuclear weapon. Now, in between these two extremes, you might think we have circumstances that are ripe for proliferation. You might think this is just right for proliferation to occur, and actually, that's not what happens. What happens in this big section here, which I'm calling the butter for bombs section, is the declining state offers concessions, or what you think of as butter, in exchange for the rising state not developing a nuclear weapon, or what you might think of as bombs. So these are butter for bombs agreements. Now, why do these agreements work? Well, what the declining state does here is it looks into the future and sees how much the rising state would be able to get if it were to develop a nuclear weapon. And the rising state says, okay, I see how much I'm going to have to give to you to maintain the peace once you have a nuclear weapon, and I'm going to give most of that to you right off the bat. Here it is. Here's an offer. I'm going to give most of what you're expecting to receive if you were to develop a nuclear weapon. I'm going to give it to you right now. Now, as the rising state, you have two choices at this point. You could either build a nuclear weapon in response to that, or you could accept the offer. If you build a nuclear weapon, you're already getting most of what you are expecting to get already, but you're still having to pay that large cost to develop a nuclear weapon. And so if you are getting most of what you already wanted and you're going to have to pay a large cost, it makes sense for you to just be happy with what you're getting and take those concessions and not build a weapon. In the meanwhile, the declining state's very happy to engage in this sort of offer because the declining state, by having the rising state not build the bomb, is able to extract the surplus created by the rising state not building the weapon, and the declining state gets to keep that for itself. So the declining state here is very happy because the rising state's not getting a weapon and it's able to keep that proliferation cost to itself. The declining state is very well off in this situation. Now, in this little wedge over here, we have the one situation where proliferation occurs. The reason it occurs here is because the cost to build is small, so that extra surplus the declining state gets to steal by not having weapons being built is very small. And as a result, the declining state prefers taking everything up front and suffering the consequences of proliferation later on. I'm not going to be talking very much about that section. I have a lot of discussion about that in my dissertation. And if you want to know more about it, feel free to send me an email or comment here, and I will talk all you want about that section. I'm not addressing it here in this presentation, however. Okay, now, you might be concerned that the butter for bombs outcome is dependent on the particular modeling situation or the modeling setup I created. And as it turns out, I've solved this game in a whole bunch of different ways with a whole bunch of different alternative specifications. And as it turns out, butter for bombs agreements are really, really robust. So you see a whole bunch of different robustness checks that I've conducted there, and the butter for bombs agreements work throughout. So don't worry about this being a particular modeling quirk. This is actually a consistent result that you can get with a whole bunch of different alternative specifications. So why then does any state proliferate? Well, that leads us to the second half of the presentation. Now I'm going to talk about war exhaustion. So in the baseline model, the declining state's cost of war remained static over time. Now, that's a very useful assumption to make, but it's not always the case empirically. Sometimes a state's desire to fight a war comes and goes. For example, this is particularly problematic when we're talking about fighting back-to-back wars for two reasons. First, it could be impractical for you to fight a war back-to-back because you are militarily destroyed in the first war. And so if you were to try to rebuild, it'd be very expensive for you to do that immediately. So you can't practically fight a war immediately back to back. Or it could just be politically undesirable for you to fight a war back to back. Your people might be exhausted from fighting a war and they just don't want to fight another war for a while. This is really applicable for the United States right now after having fought in Afghanistan and Iraq. No one in the United States is particularly interested in launching yet another war. And while this seems like it would be conducive to cooperation, right? This is the desire not to want to fight a war, at least in the short term. This actually leads to a commitment problem, which forces the rising state to build a nuclear weapon. So the intuition here, and again, I want to focus on intuition, not the sort of game theoretical mechanics about what's going on, but just purely intuition about why this causes proliferation to occur. So imagine that we're here today at that dot, in that middle of that butter for bombs region. If we're in the butter for bombs region, this is where we're happy to engage in agreement where the declining state offers concessions to the rising state and the rising state doesn't build weapons. So everything is peachy keen in today's framework. But what about tomorrow? What if tomorrow we move into this framework where the rising state, or rather the declining state, now has smaller costs of preventative war, and so it's now willing to intervene? Well, once we reach that point, remember that the declining state no longer has to give carrots to the rising state to convince the rising state not to build nuclear weapons. But that's really bad for the rising state because now the rising state is not receiving any concessions whatsoever. And so in order to force the declining state to continue giving concessions, the rising state needs to build weapons while it still can. In particular, that means it has to build weapons today in order to force concessions out of the declining state tomorrow. And so if we think about this empirically, you can make a very plausible argument that the Soviet Union in 1949 fits the butter for bombs region. The United States was not willing to intervene. I'll talk about why that was the case in a second. And the Soviet Union felt that the costs were worthwhile, but it was still relatively costly to build the weapons. So the Soviet Union is in this situation where it should be getting butter for bombs agreements from the United States. If the United States' decision or desire to launch preventative war remained constant over time. Unfortunately, it was not remaining constant over time. While it was the case that the United States was unwilling to intervene in, say, 1948, remember this is the time that the Berlin blockade occurred, the United States, the Truman administration in particular, when confronted with this problem, actually took really great pains to take the least provocative response possible to the Soviet aggression while still being able to maintain West Berlin and feed West Berlin and provide heating and fuel for West Berlin. The goal here with the Berlin airlift, though, was to not engage the Soviet Union at all costs, simply because the United States population at the time was really, really eager to not fight another war. There was also a practical problem with intervening in 1949 or 1948, right before the Soviet Union proliferated, and that was a lack of intelligence. So you might think that, hey, the United States had a nuclear monopoly at the time and could have very easily just done some sort of surgical strike to make sure that the Soviet Union would not build any nuclear weapons or not have a successful nuclear weapons program. As it turns out, this slide is blank because there were no American spies in Russia in 1945. So the United States actually lacked the military intelligence to be able to conduct a surgical strike to stop the Soviet Union in 1945. If the United States wanted to conduct a preventative war, it would have required actually conquering or taking over most of the Soviet Union to actually be successful. So at the time, the United States was unwilling to engage the Soviet Union despite having a nuclear monopoly and did not have any good intelligence about how to stop a Soviet nuclear weapons program. But that all was changing. And in fact, if you can think about this, if you think about a counterfactual Soviet Union that did not build nuclear weapons in 1960, at that point, the United States would have been in the situation where launching preventative war would have actually been a credible threat if the Soviet Union continued to proliferate. And that's for two reasons. One, you can think about this just in terms of what actually happened. So the United States was unwilling to engage in 1948 when it held a nuclear monopoly, and yet during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States took much more aggressive actions. And in fact, when the blockade around Cuba was going on, the Kennedy administration actually believed that the odds of war with the Soviet Union were somewhere between 1 in 3 and 1 in 2. So fast forward about 15 years, we now see that the United States is actually willing to engage the Soviet Union, and not only willing to engage any Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union that actually has nuclear weapons at this point. So fast forward 15 years, the United States is no longer suffering from that war exhaustion where the population doesn't want to fight a war at all. And now we have some sort of willingness to fight a war. And this is, again, with a Soviet Union that has nuclear weapons. And then the other half of it is that the United States was actually in a much better intelligence position by the 1960s. This is mainly for two reasons. First, the CIA that we now are familiar with established itself in 1952 and was able to get agents onto the ground providing good intelligence back to headquarters. And second, of course, the U-2 spy plane had its first flight in 1955, and by 1956 it was taking overhead aerial shots of the Soviet Union, which would have allowed us to figure out where the Soviet Union was developing nuclear weapons and to actually be able to create a surgical strike to destroy those facilities. So all told, think about this just in terms of a thought experiment. Suppose that the Soviet Union did not proliferate by 1960. In other words, imagine that the United States had temporarily bought off the Soviet Union in that 11-year period in between 1949 and 1960, in this counterfactual world where the Soviet Union does not have nuclear weapons. Would the United States still give the Soviet Union concessions in 1960? Well, probably not. The United States was much more willing to engage in a war because the war exhaustion was gone, and they were much better prepared because the intelligence problems were fixed. There was no intelligence after World War II. There was a lot of intelligence by the 50s. And so if you're the United States, why use expensive carrots in the form of concessions to induce Soviet compliance when you can use that stick, and that stick is free for you? So all told, that means proliferation in 1949 was a rational strategy for the Soviet Union. Settlement was possible, yes, in the short term, but the terms of settlement would have eventually gone bad for the Soviet Union. And so the Soviet Union viewed nuclear development as a way of locking in those concessions. So proliferation is therefore rational, despite the inefficiency that it created in the system. All right, to wrap things up here, I did three things. First, I argued that existing explanations for proliferation give necessary conditions for proliferation, but not sufficient. And the reason that they're not sufficient is because any sort of explanation for proliferation needs to explain why states don't choose to just bargain their way out of it, especially when efficient Pareto-improving agreements do work, in theory, in equilibrium. And then lastly, I showed that arms treaties fail if declining states cannot credibly commit to not leverage the future threat of preventative war. This causes that commitment problem that leads to rising states building weapons to lock in concessions. And so that finishes things here. Thank you for listening to me. Go ahead and leave a comment on YouTube if you'd like me to respond to it there. I would be happy to do that. You can also email me with questions at my email address, williamspaniel@gmail.com, or you can follow me on Twitter at GameTheory101. I'd, again, love to have your comments on the paper itself, which you can download by taking a look at the video description underneath this video. So again, thank you very much for listening to me, and I hope to hear from you later. Take care.